Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. It's a Red Bull sandwich at the Australian Grand Prix with Max Verstappen on pole, Sergio Perez starting P20, but the big story was the two Mercedes, P2 and P3, a massive improvement in pace over the last couple of races. What has changed, especially with so many upgrades in the works for Mercedes over the coming weeks, and Fernando Alonso reckons they will be winning races by the halfway point of the season. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button if you enjoy, subscribe if you're new as always. Now I've got to talk about Sergio Perez. A shocking day for him in FP3 and of course in qualifying. Went off track like 4 times in FP3, had loads of issues with his brakes locking up and just controlling the car under braking, certainly into turn 3. And in qualifying, this was quite remarkable really. Mistake from Perez in a way because yes, the car might have been partly at fault, but the fact that he was pushing in this manner in his very first lap in Q1, where he probably didn't need to do anything spectacular to get through, at least further in the session, locked up, put it into the gravel, and this is why we love gravel traps in Formula 1, right? Because he got punished hard for his mistake here, wasn't able to get it going again, and complained on the radio about it was the same issue he was having in FP3 that was, well, affecting his car here. Now, the thing is, it's funny really, is that Red Bull don't really say what this issue was, even if there is one. Christian Horner says, yeah, okay, we're going to look to see if there was a problem, but he hasn't even confirmed that there was an issue, so I don't know whether Perez just made a mistake, but it did seem like something was off with Perez's car because he was having a really hard time with it. And Amos have actually discussed this and says there's a chance that the engine was pushing past the braking phase and there was just some sort of errors with the transmission there, such that they might install a new battery and a new power electronics in the car to try and either solve some of these issues or, because they're starting P20 anyway, take a couple of new parts because it's not going to affect you in terms of starting race position. So remarkable stuff, terrible day for Perez, but that leaves the standings or for qualifying as this. So lots of key storylines here. Perez P20, Verstappen P1 by about 0.2 of a second from George Russell in the Mercedes. A phenomenal lap from him. Hamilton was just behind for the 3rd time in a row this season, but then it's Alonso, then it's Sainz, Leclerc. The Ferraris had a tough time again. They were looking quite competitive, and I think based on what they could have done, if you took all their best sectors and put them together, they never really put a complete lap together, either of the Ferrari drivers. Leclerc surprisingly behind Sainz. Sainz might have got P3, P4. Leclerc could have been a couple of tenths further up the road as well, but Ferrari squandered the chance. We know they're usually worse in race pace anyway, but Albon to me was one of the other stories of the day in P8. What a drive from him. Only 0.3 of a second off Leclerc in his Williams, so great for Williams and also great drive from him. Hulkenberg into Q3 was super impressive as well, so, and McLaren, despite it being a good track for them last year, again an absolute shambles this time around. So Hamilton was very satisfied with this ride. I'm sure he's not happy to be behind his teammate again, as we've seen over the last few days, but nonetheless, being P3 in the position that he's in after still struggling with the car so far this season is very optimistic for Mercedes, and even saying hopefully they can give Red Bull a run for their money because there's 4 DRS zones here now. If you can stay in a train behind Verstappen, you've got many chances per lap to try and keep up with him, and the Red Bull advantage that we've seen so far this year wasn't there this session and hasn't really been there so far this weekend. Even in race pace, they don't look quite as dominant as they have done previously. I think it's in part track specific. It's mainly front limited around Albert Park, so the rear deficiencies in the Mercedes that they were having in Bahrain aren't so prevalent at this specific circuit, and on paper they should be quite good around here, and they certainly are. The Red Bull will still be the fastest car and probably even more so in the race, but Mercedes are very optimistic about this, and because Perez is so far down, they have some potential strategic opportunities, right? When let's say it goes Verstappen P1, Russell P2, Hamilton P3, nothing changes after the start of the Grand Prix, there's potential chances for them to pit Russell early and go for an undercut. They can leave Hamilton out for the overcut attempt, so there's more possibilities when you've got 2 cars fighting against one. There might not be a fight, right? Wolf says that more than likely Verstappen will just drive away into the distance, but nonetheless Mercedes are far closer than I believe they expected to be. George Russell says the car felt alive. Honestly, I'm a bit disappointed to miss out on pole. Goes to show we've definitely got potential still to come. They know there's massive things they're working on in the wind tunnel right now that might look more like a Red Bull style design, but at this weekend they're already quite close, and they say their car is going to get a hell of a lot better in a few weeks time. And even Toto Wolff says he felt like the team needed this as a bit of a confidence boost for the team. Hamilton says the same thing, a glimpse of hope that will spur everyone on. We just know that if we can find that bit of performance that they clearly extracted from the setup and other elements this weekend, they can get even closer to Red Bull in the future. And I'm saying that, look, we can start fighting for wins, hopefully soon enough from Imola and beyond when their new package arrives. And they're certainly closer than I thought they'd be, and certainly closer than they thought they'd be. And even Hamilton says, hoping like a day like his first year when he arrived in Formula 1, Australia 2007, turn 1, where he went from 5th to 3rd and overtook Fernando Alonso, his teammate, to really stamp his name in the Formula 1 scene. And as he says, I don't know if anyone remembers this, but it'd be awesome if we could do that. Now, I believe this might be a slight jab back at Alonso, and there's been some quite funny things the last few days between Hamilton and Alonso, especially on this, I don't know if anyone remembers comments here, which could be related to this statement from Fernando Alonso the other day. So Hamilton commented that the RB19 was the fastest car he's ever seen. I think Hamilton might have been referring in part just to the pure straight line advantage they had in Jeddah when compared to what the Mercedes was able to do. But Alonso says, look, he's not agreeing with that at all. Obviously, back in 2014, 2015, Hamilton had great cars. He has a short memory. He's getting old. Now, this is kind of done in jest a bit, right? Alonso's poking a bit of fun the way of Hamilton, but saying that he's got a bad memory and Hamilton's getting old and forgetting about things. So Hamilton now clapping back and saying, oh, I don't know if you remember, Alonso, but in 2007, what happened then in Australia? And even Alonso went on to say after this that with a normal car, you can see that Hamilton's got his weaknesses. So kind of funny in a way that as soon as this happens, the very next day, Hamilton out-qualifies Alonso, and, obviously many are reminded of this image that Hamilton tweeted out last year when there was a bit of banter between the two of them as well after the Grand Prix in Spa, and this, of course, was that start in Australia 2007, where Hamilton goes around the outside of turn 1 to take position on Alonso. And it's funny in a way that now after qualifying concludes, where before qualifying he was talking about, all this about Hamilton, and now after qualifying, instead Alonso is saying that actually their car's been quite good. Alonso said in this interview here that if you read into Mercedes' comments, you would think their car wasn't good enough to get out of Q1, or like the car wouldn't be good enough to get into Q3 is the type of thing that he's getting at, I believe, in this comment. But, then of course what he really means is that actually their car's an awful lot better than they have been letting on, which I'm not necessarily sure is true. They were competitive relatively in Jeddah compared to Aston Martin, but the Red Bull was so much faster. But Alonso does say Mercedes, who say they want to abandon this car, are actually very quick. They have been hiding performance. Now, I don't know if this is some sort of Alonso master plan to try and make Mercedes stick with their current concept and design so that they don't bring their presumably significantly better package relatively shortly. And more than likely, this is something of a one-off in some regard, right? I mean, look, it's a track that seems to suit their car quite well. They seem to nail the conditions in the tyre warm-up and these other factors that Red Bull struggled with a bit more. We don't know what their race pace looks like yet, especially relative to the Red Bull. So, I mean, I don't think Mercedes will be too quick here to say, wow, this car's actually good, because fundamentally, even Amos here talk about this and say, look, does Mercedes really need a new car? Like, they're obviously quite close now, but for Mercedes, 2.5, 3/10 of a second off pole position is still not going to cut it, especially when they're probably slower than that in race pace, right? Mercedes are a competitive team. They want to win races. They want to win championships. They're not satisfied with being 2/10 off the Red Bull at one of their better circuits, their best circuits so far this season, it seems. They want more progression. They want to be the fastest car, obviously. So Mercedes aren't going to look at this and decide, all right, our car's actually fine, guys. We just got it wrong all along, because, if they were to get pole here 1-2, then maybe they would have changed their mind a little bit. But the way it is, like, they know that this car still isn't going to cut it on the majority of circuits. And even Toto Wolff says they shouldn't swing towards exuberance. They need to ensure they stay grounded and, make sure that, okay, yeah, this car is doing better than they thought, but there's still a lot more to come from other alternatives they're bringing to the track in the future. But it's got to be said, they must have found something this weekend, whether it's purely in terms of setup, whether it is track related, or whether they've just managed to find a new way to set up their car which makes it more competitive, because obviously they want to set up their car for the race as well, which I'm sure Verstappen has also done, but their gap has come down every Grand Prix so far. Bahrain, 6.5/10, Saudi Arabia, 6/10, and now in Australia, 2/10, really 2.5/10, with George Russell being all of these times. An incredibly impressive performance from him in qualifying so far, 3-0 over Hamilton now so far this season. Russell's qualifying laps have always been incredibly good. Mr. Saturday, right? And you watch the onboard, I know he did the with Kurun Chandok, right? They kind of analysed his lap compared to Verstappen's, and like his lap, Russell's was incredibly good. Hamilton's a bit more shaky, but in race pace, I think Hamilton's generally going to be stronger than Russell, but Russell started out this year very strongly indeed, and it's going to be a titanic battle between the two of them, especially if their car becomes competitive shortly. The other thing just to mention before we close out here is on Perez, because of course Verstappen came from P15 to P2 relatively easily in Saudi Arabia. Will Perez be able to accomplish the same thing? Of course, look, P20 is more of a challenge anyway, but fundamentally, they're in our park here. This is not an easy circuit to overtake on, especially if the dirty air effect is back this year more than it has been in the past. And we know Verstappen's pretty blunt, right? But he was asked the question, like, can Perez do anything from last on the grid? And he says, yeah, more than likely not. Not for me, I don't expect him to do much type thing, or at least be a factor in the race, which I imagine will be the case. We saw in the past with circuits where it's trickier to overtake. Verstappen at, for example, last year, Singapore, he had a tough time there coming from further back on the grid. So it's expected Perez won't do much, but even then, can they fix his car properly? What progress can Perez potentially make through the field? Because if Verstappen does make it through the race with no issues and wins the Grand Prix with the fastest lap, then already Perez's championship charge, which was never really there in the first place, let's be perfectly honest, is potentially already dead in the water after all the talk from the media that Perez is going to somehow win the championship this year. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.